Welcome to another episode of Disentangling Radical Bullshit and trying to figure out what is actually radical, what is actually progressive from the onslaught of progressive bullshit that we are all drowning in the academia, in public forums, in pretty much every discussion, is that this power equals privilege, vicariously traumatized, constantly traumatized, intersectional rhetoric has taken over absolutely all conversation. And even on one of my favorite subreddits, our critical theory has been destroyed by these people who cannot control their own trauma, basically, and who have to basically police and regulate because they think that harassment is around every corner, white supremacy is around every corner, racism and sexism is around every corner. And it is a kind of shock doctrine that we can see that Naomi Klein's shock doctrine mostly applies to the left today. I want to talk about a very special man, Gabriel Rockhill. You can see him above right here. This guy has an amazing historical account of the missing information, the gaps within leftist cancel culture for the last 50 years. So now you can see that we are only now becoming aware of a historical cancel culture, for lack of a better word, a historical regression, a historical basically gaps in our thinking, gaps in what is allowed to be talked about within academia. And my friends, I can tell you that as an incredibly well-read person myself, I would love to show you my library of 10,000 books, in my PDFs. I have so many books in my brain. And only through extensive research do you come to start to realize that there are a lot of gaps. What can be a whole category of research, whole categories of research have been basically muted. And what Gabriel Rockhill here talks about is how specific kinds of progressive language have been promoted over other kinds, eclipsing other kinds of possible progressive language. So who are the people that are elevated and basically, I think eclipse is the best word, eclipse all other kinds of critical thinkers. And that's basically what happens with regards to this idea of scholasticism and this idea of historicity, which I am going to be making an in-depth video regarding Leo Strauss and Sloterdijk and a bunch of these thinkers who are taking on the question of historicity. And long story short, basically the argument that I'm going to be making is that a Hegelian synthesis means that you start from history and then you move towards something like a universal, non-rooted reality. Or even another way to look at it is an incredibly rooted reality in terms of seeing yourself within a DNA structure, within an ancestral history, within that kind of Hegelian outlook. Now, the problem here is that political political standpoint epistemologies have basically destroyed the conversations that we can have. So I have found this school here, and I'm going to be trying to apply for this school. This is an amazing school. It's the best one I found. Here we can see Adolf Reed, and another speaker here is Jennifer Ponce, and I looked at her work, and her dissertation is about the defense of art or something. And if you follow my Ritual Traces series, you will know that I think that art is not at all a way of escaping, or is not at all a way of rebelling against. Art is totally 99% subsumed. Sure, you can have an art piece that wakes people up one day, but again, as you look at my Ritual Traces series, it is our daily rituals, right? You can have art is based in the daily rituals of capitalism, unfortunately. It's not something that is transcendent in itself. Transcendence comes when art and ritual come together. Ritual, our everyday ritual, how we, we can have a ritual of checking our privilege every day, this constant checking our privilege ritual. But then if we go and uphold privileges in our everyday lives with and interactions with other people, then what the heck was the point of the checking our privileges line? The whole thing that's happening now is that you are constantly aware of privileges, and then you're constantly reminded, remember, you are brown. You will never amount to anything. There's this constant uh, fear, this constant fear of not doing wrong if you're white passing or more in the privileged aspect of things. And then there's this hesitation culture that again only affects people that actually cared in the first place. Now, another video that I'm going to be doing, other than this video regarding historicity and scholasticism and Leo Strauss, is a video on, now we can see that there are plenty of people like me who are, I don't want to say ex-liberals or ex-left-wing people, who are joining almost the right wing. And I have also a problem with this too. So we are going to be taking a look at especially what's happening with what Jennifer Ponce says here. And I'm going to be thinking that is Adolph Reed's words, but the way that Jennifer Ponce says it here, I don't agree with it at all. I think that they are the words of Adolph Reed, but the way that Jennifer Ponce says it is completely, I think, problematic. And what do I mean by this? I mean that there is a liberal pushback, and the ultimate, or the pushback against the left is coming from the liberals who are almost overtly supporting the ruling classes again. So the ultimate example of this is going to be in a book review that I'm going to be doing of San Francisco by that gentleman, is the ultimate example of this kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater too. If you've seen my throwing out the baby with the bathwater 1 video, which is the defense of Spivak. So here, Gabriel Rockhill and a lot of these thinkers do a really good job of critiquing, but then I also want to be pushing back a little bit, kind of defending the post-colonial theory. I want to be defending some ideals of intersectionality here, because this group is, my dream group in terms of they are analyzing this, and I highly recommend that you check out their channel, the Critical Theory Workshop channel. Amazing work, much better than any other channel that I found in this regard, any other channel doing actual critical theory today. Actual critical theory in the academy and in public forums and on Reddit is pretty much dead. We can't have debate anymore because political standpoint epistemology, a power equals privilege logic has stifled all communication regardless, and the people that you're talking to are mostly people who are put into those positions because of affirmative action in the first place. The ultimate example being my videos about Carrie Bourassa, the narcissist who has taken over Canadian identity politics for so long, for the last 20 years, controlling grant money. And this conversation that we're going to be having is incredibly important. I'm so thankful, and that's why today I'm in a solar punk rather than the cyberpunk, because I'm so happy I found this group. So I have a lot of problems with what Jennifer is going to say, and I'm going to be interjecting in everything that she says. So here we go.
Introduction, Karen, and thank you very much for having us here, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really thrilled to be speaking along with Adolf, and because I have enormous admiration for his work and have learned so much from it. So I wanted to start by just talking about some of the reasons why I think his work is so important, and then talk about how it connects to my own research and my own recent projects. Which are more in fields of Latin American and Latinx studies, of contemporary immigration, and of contemporary cultural production. So I think some of the things I just wanted to emphasize that I think are so important about his work, and that were also highlighted in an article that I know some of the audience here read in preparation for this talk, are the points that Adolf makes about ideology being pragmatic and grounded in material practices, and that it must be understood as part of the social totality. So this Marxist perspective stresses that racial ideologies, which cannot be separated from racist practices, have evolved as a constitutive element of social relations that are anchored in the capitalist mode of production. And as Adolf argues, these and other ideologies of descriptive difference, that is, ideologies that impute essential qualities to groups of people in order to sort them into hierarchies, function to legitimize capitalist social relations by naturalizing them. This operates in regard to concrete social relations in concrete contexts, and the fully historical and pragmatic character of racial ideologies is what accounts for their flexibility and variance across space and time. Now, I think these insights have been very, and this approach to thinking about race as it operates within capitalist class relations have been very important for my research. For example, in my recent work on U.S. immigration policies, anti-immigrant racism, it has helped me to understand how racism has operated in tandem with practices of extra economic coercion, such as state and parastate violence, in the formation of labor markets for U.S.
So you can see, before she continues her own talk about her own work, you can see why, people like me are so pissed off, because these are the racists.
Capital, and particularly in controlling immigrant workers. There's a lot of wonderful scholarship on this history, but I would really especially recommend the book No One is Illegal by Justin Akers-Tecklon and Mike Davis. And in the beginning of this book, there's a section written by Mike Davis that I think really illustrates very effectively the kind of flexibility and pragmatism of racial ideologies as it pertains to the hyper-exploitation and control that's exercised upon immigrant workers. And it's a kind of episodic history of kind of successive assaults against immigrant workers in California, starting in the mid-19th century into the present, looking at racist ideologies as well as kind of forms of vigilante violence organized successively against Chinese workers, Japanese workers, Filipino workers, Mexican workers, but also against IWW and also against labor organizers. And this kind of history is one that really shows the kind of function of the mobilization of racism to break labor movements, to criminalize them, to divide workers, and the kind of just looking at the history and the kind of variance of racial ideologies that have been used, and then the variance in groups that have been targeted and why they've been targeted at specific moments, really, I think, helps us understand why this kind of materialist understanding of racism is so important. Because this history really cannot be understood either by positing some kind of trans-historical racist structure that exists outside of these class structures, or by looking to individuals' attitudes or psychology. Because really to understand what is at stake in these racist practices, or why some groups have the power to enforce them on others, really requires an examination of the class struggles in which racist practices have their meaning and in which racist ideologies emerge. And I think this is very much the case for more recent discourses that legitimize the repression and hyper-exploitation of immigrant workers, but which very studiously avoid references to familiar signifiers of race. Instead, in our contemporary moment, we often see discourses about security and criminality doing the kind of legitimizing work that we're talking about. But again, it is crucial that we don't end our analysis with exposing the fact of racism or just tracing the intricacies of racial ideologies, because that type of descriptive work will not necessarily help us understand the social relations in which these practices are anchored. Instead, for example, if we analyze contemporary anti-immigrant racism as it operates within the political economy of the US, we can come up with much more useful analyses. These would address, for example, how the legal and ideological construction of immigrant labor as a distinct category of labor works to make it super exploitable by, among other things, making immigrant workers isolated, tightly controlled, and denying them rights accorded to citizens. And we would also have to understand how the super exploitation of one sector of the working class works to put downward pressure on wages for all workers. This type of analysis would also require us to address how immigrant labor pools have been organized in different ways historically, be that by guest worker programs or by illegalization, and how these different modalities have also utilized distinctive racial ideologies, just for the difference between, let's say, at some moments constructing Mexican immigrant workers as tractable sources of labor and other moments as potential criminals, right? And I think the contemporary illegalization of some immigrant workers and mobilization of racism against them must be understood within these broader dynamics of class struggle. And we can also must see how the kind of see them as part of the expansion in the US since the 1970s of labor regimes in which workers have no right to organize or negotiate a wage, which includes prison labor regimes and workfare in addition to illegalized immigrant labor. And furthermore, we would have to look at the class struggles that incite international migration in the first place. In the case of Latin America,
I wish we were also looking at the relationship between carceral feminism and the state and everything that she's talking about. See, this is why I point to feminism all the time, is because we don't realize that standpoint epistemology is really the basis for all of this crap. A political standpoint epistemology rather than an analytical standpoint epistemology. A kind of intersectionality that doesn't include the voices of white men, and who were traditionally the socialist unions? They were white men, right? So all of these socialist unions, you've basically cut out, turned half the population into scabs, historically, and you've destroyed the socialist unions that were made by white men, right? And that kind of story, we are still unable to say it as it is. It's that the failure of feminism to work with socialism, to work with the socialist unions. What feminists did is exactly what they're doing now, which is bypassing, right, the solidarity and going straight to those with power and groveling at the feet and bootlicking uh, and making friends or allying themselves with the CIA-backed Gloria Steinem version of how things should be going. And we can see Gabriel Rockhill specifically talking about how the CIA is actively involved in the creation of an anti-communist left.
US imperialism, of course, has been a major factor in this regard, be it through militarism, overthrow of governments, as in the case of Honduras, or by the economic conditions created by US and transnational elites that force people off their land or from their homes in order to survive. So my point here is that the racialization of immigrant workers cannot be abstracted from the historical class struggles in which this racism does its practical work. And doing so may produce moral expose, but not the kind of analysis that can form the basis of strategic politics. Soon. And Adolf has been so right to insistently mark out the difference between moral expose and useful analysis. And in doing that, Adolf's work, I think, does not only distinguish between correct and incorrect modes of analyzing racism. Crucially, he identifies the class character and social function of contemporary ideologies that extract racism from class struggles and attribute historical causality to racial ideologies in and of themselves. And he argues that in the US, the dominance of these ideologies about race has been a symptom of the triumph of neoliberal ideology, which naturalizes class relations, reduces the critique of social inequality to the critique of racial disparity, and suggests that justice could be achieved by the removal of impediments to equal participation in markets. So it shouldn't come as a surprise then that these type of ideologies and critiques are what dominate political discourse, corporate media, and the intellectual production at US universities. And again, I want to emphasize this is not a matter of correct versus incorrect only a matter of correct versus incorrect ways of conceptualizing, historicizing racism. It is a matter of recognizing that these anti-racist discourses, in fact, are on the side of reaction as they function to shore up the power of elites that is maintained through racial brokerage politics and the structures of racial liberalism. And so from that, I want to springboard to talk about one of my current projects, which I'm collaborating with my friend and colleague Anya Lumba, who's also on this call. And we're working on a critical analysis of post-colonial and decolonial theory and juxtaposing that to anti-colonial analyses that come out of Marxism. I've been concentrating more on an analysis of decolonial theory as it looms so large in Latin American studies within the US, and I think has kind of also popularized discussions of coloniality more broadly. So I think some of what I see as the problems of this type of thinking, I think, are very much connected to what I've tried to summarize about what I find so useful in Adolf's work. And in a nutshell, what I'm arguing is that some of these very influential traditions of anti-Marxist, post-colonial, and decolonial thought that are very influential in the US Academy are really doing the work of radical recuperation. That is, they pose as radical, generally on the basis of their critique of racism, but in fact, they're reactionary. And that is, they work to ideologically recuperate popular anti-systemic struggles by obscuring their material stakes and ventriloquizing them with a theoreticist discourse that really severs ideology from its basis in class struggle.
So here, my critique against Jennifer Ponce. Now, we saw that Adolf Reed in the first part. That was all Adolf Reed. And I didn't really have any problem with that. Now she's going to go extrapolate from what Adolf Reed says and basically throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that I find extremely dangerous. So equating intersectionality with post-colonial theory, that's a mistake. Right? And the reason why that isn't talked about is because that obfuscation, which she is talking about, is part and parcel to the whole problem. And in fact, Jennifer here, if you don't do your research correctly, right, then you become part of increasing obfuscation as well. And because we live in a publish or perish mentality, especially within academia, right? You can't do any legitimate work within academia. And again, I really highly recommend that Gabriel Rockhill lecture, which I will be doing a critique on soon.
I'm also borrowing this term radical recuperator from Gabriel Rockhill, who's also a collaborator of mine, who has used this term really to talk about kind of the promotion of an anti-communist left intelligentsia and its promotion by elites, including by the US state, and this idea that the kind of figure of the radical recuperator in theoretical thought works to also police the left border of critique, providing a kind of critique that seems like it captures oppositional elements, but that invariably casts Marxist analysis and revolutionary socialism as being beyond the pale. And that's precisely what kind of anti-Marxist decolonial thought does.
Okay, so here is my defense of anti-Marxist decolonial thought. Again, as I said in my Speedback video, defensive Speedback video, what are we talking about? What particularly are we talking about? Okay, Marxism is a particular cure for a particular disease. Marxism is a cure for the first, second, third estate. It cannot be a universalizable thing that you bring in the sixth, seventh, and eighth, and ninth estates, people who live in caves in China, people who live in the mountains in Azerbaijan. These people, right, where the seeing like a state, these people are not part of any productive economy at all. They are not employees. They are not the proletariat. The people of the mountain are not proletarians. And yes, they are going to be talking about the noble savage narrative. But let's not conflate the issues here. Yes, there is a problem with the left and seeing that, for example, this black person in Africa can't do any evil. They have a noble savage, or saying that, and the exact same parallels can be found in the infantilization of female responsibility when it comes to feminism. Feminism is an infantilization movement, just like how we are critiquing the noble savage arguments on the left. We don't do the same when it comes to the infantilization arguments when it comes to feminism, right? The reason why I'm a better feminist than all feminists that you know is because I actually take feminism seriously. I expect feminists to follow what they preach or whatever. I expect feminism to follow what they preach because I don't treat the people like noble savages or people like infants. I think that we all have a responsibility. This idea or this promotion of that, that the feminist movement doesn't have to care about men for one thing, or that you go to this power equals privilege logic that makes affirmative action seem not like a racist thing, when in fact affirmative action is absolutely racist. The kinds of affirmative action that we have today, where everybody has to repeat the same kinds of idioms, that is not that is not the kind of affirmative action that I want, right? That's the affirmative action that we have, though. The kind of affirmative action that you get your affirmative action if you are able to repeat the popular idioms. Now, I hope that you understood the connection that I'm making between the power equals privilege when it comes to race that we're all critiquing here. We are all critiquing here that there is a left-wing noble savage argument being made here, but then we don't apply that critique to the same kind of feminist infantilization that's happening with the power equals privilege argument. When the power equals privilege argument is applied to race, we see it as clearly as racist. Lots of black people, lots of men usually, are don't want affirmative action. I don't want affirmative action for me. I want to be judged by the basis of my merit, compared to the feminists who don't mind affirmative action and they think that affirmative action is actually necessary, and without affirmative action. But again, the problem with affirmative action is that it socially reproduces itself, and it actually. So what I mean by this is that affirmative action, identity-based affirmative action rather than class-based affirmative action specifically, these identity markers that we are allowed to get into a certain school, they are or workplace or whatever, or fill a certain quota. They are obviously a racist yoke. It's obviously a racist yoke. It is only because of feminism that we don't see affirmative action as being infantilizing or racist. We say it is a need, it is something that we need to deal with historical discrimination with. When in fact, what it does, only what it does, is reinforce the same kinds of prejudice. You are brown. Remember, you are brown. You got into this institution, into this job, because you are brown. Now, that kind of infantilization, for some reason, doesn't translate into feminism. And we have to call that out. There's a reason why there's so many colored, usually men, fighting this affirmative action thing. Even a lot of black men who talk about this, and they feel that this is a way of looking down on us. It's a way of infantilizing us. It's a way of patronizing us. It's a way of patronizing. We feel it. We say it. We try to voice it all the time. It doesn't matter because feminists love this shit.
And in fact, it goes with the whole feminist pantheon of always moving goalposts, of always moving definitions. The reason why you do that is because feminism is based on avoiding responsibility, of infantilizing women. This mindset is completely under scrutiny when it comes to race over and over and over. There is so much pushback, but there's no pushback when it comes to feminism. And in fact, when we, the people who are trying to voice this as being a fucking racist thing, we are taken as the racist ones at the end of the day. We are taken as the sexist ones at the end of the day. That is insane. This is the kind of gaslighting culture that feminism has created. Nothing else. It is intersectional feminism that's created this. It's intersectional feminism that brainwashes us into thinking that affirmative action is something that is necessary. Look at what affirmative action has actually done. Look at the enrollment rates. Look at what the practical implications of affirmative action are. Has it actually helped people, or does it work just to reinforce? Affirmative action, if it's going to be there, it should be based on class only, not these stupid identity markers. So let's just compare these two athletes. What is the public perception of her, and what is the public perception of her? Why? It's because one of them constantly is playing and is normalized to play the race or gender card. One of them is completely indoctrinated and doesn't give a fuck about the population, about what people think. The other one...
Just another quick one about Angela's question on equality just before. We've got quite a large pay dispute happening with our Australian women's soccer team at the moment. Is it frustrating for you as someone who's so prominent in your sport? And we heard you say on the Ellen show the other day you are the richest fighter in UFC, that sort of thing is still going on?
I think that how much you get paid should have something to do with how much money you bring in. I'm the highest paid fighter not because Dana and Lorenzo wanted to do something nice for the ladies. They do it because I bring in the highest numbers. They do it because I make them the most money. And I think that the money that they make should be proportionate to the money that they bring in.
You know, if I got to a point where I had almost 50 fights, I would probably be making close to the same amount of money that Floyd does. But at this point, I have 11. So I can't expect it to be exactly equal, yeah.
See, the women's team argued that they were being paid less than the men for the same work, and the court found that that wasn't true. Those were lies. The court found that the women's national team was paid more than the men. Yes, they were paid more than the men, per game and overall. So their rate of pay was higher, and they got paid more money in aggregate. The court also found that U.S. Soccer offered the women's national team the men's deal, and the women's national team rejected it. So why did that happen? Well, the men's deal was a pay-to-play deal. So the men only got paid if they played in the game. They got no benefits and no guaranteed money. While, on the other hand, the women negotiated for and got full benefits and guaranteed money no matter if they played or not. So later, when the women did the math and saw that they could have gotten more money if they would have taken the men's deal that they previously rejected, they sued U.S. Soccer, yelling discrimination. So the court essentially said that you can't reject the men's deal when it was first offered to you, then agree to the deal that you have now and claim gender discrimination. It doesn't work that way. Seek to retroactively impose on themselves. The first time the women's national team requested bonuses equivalent to those received by the men's national team was in January 2016. The United States Soccer Federation rejected that proposal, however, because the women's national team was not asking for a pay-to-play agreement similar to the men's national team. Instead, it was asking for all the upsides of the men's national team CBA, namely higher bonuses, without any of the drawbacks. No base salary. In May 2016, the United States Soccer Federation offered the women's national team a pay-to-play proposal similar to the men's national team CBA, but the women's national team rejected it, preferring an agreement that involves some elements of guaranteed compensation. But facts don't matter in our world anymore. So there was massive public pressure both by the mainstream media and by fans of the U.S. soccer for the women to be paid this extra money from nowhere. No one cared that the women's claims were essentially lies and that a factual analysis by the court showed that the women's national team's claims were nonsense. It was all about discrimination because the women's national team said so. The facts did not support their claim. And this pay discrepancy between the two teams got even worse. See, during COVID, the men got paid nothing because they had no guarantees. Remember, the men only got paid if they played in the game. And when COVID hit, they canceled all the games. So the men got paid nothing. But the women's team got paid multi-million-dollar deals. They got millions in salary and millions in benefits. Yet they were the ones claiming pay discrimination. Was this case ever about gender discrimination? Now, I know the women's national team is out on Good Morning America today yelling, yes, we won, we won. They did win. They won because we live in a society where facts don't matter.
Over the course of, X amount of years, we actually made more money than the men. And which dollar for dollar, that is true, which is actually a testament to how successful we have been.
You can see how much respect people have for Rhonda because she is fighting on the basis of merit. She doesn't need affirmative action. She doesn't need extra leg up. She is working even despite the historical shit that's been placed upon her. That is what makes us strong. That is what makes us amazing, is the fact that even with the historical crap, the historical discrimination, we can still come back. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is, if you actually try to search on Google, if you go and search, and this is the most cancerous thing, right? Because even though this is the obvious common ground perspective, this is the most sensible position. If you do a Google search on this issue, on soccer, equal pay, women, if you write that, or if you write anything about affirmative action, you get tailored feminist responses, because the feminists and the intersectional people, they've taken over the algorithms of Google. So no wonder we live in a society where we don't trust our institutions, we don't trust academia, because academia, our institutions, the media is completely enmeshed in spewing out bullshit over and over and over. What do you think we are? Do you think we are stupid? So it is a concerted effort to brainwash us into, and this is the most strong argument I have here. When you give undeserved leg up to people, you are turning them into the N-word. The N-word is not a noun, it's a adjective, right? It's an action word, and maybe it's a verb even. It's something that you become. You become Igrified. I'm not going to say the word. You become Igrified. Affirmative action Igrifies all color people. Affirmative action Igrifies, you know what word I'm using here, Igrifies women. Affirmative action Igrifies minorities on purpose, because we are meant to be reminded of our position 24/7 a day. We always have to do privilege calculations. Why? Because some group of traumatized people can't get out of that thinking, so we all have to be Igrified because of it. Affirmative action is a age-old way of making sure we feel like the underclass.
And I think there's also, Gabriel has used this term also really to talk about French structuralist or post-structuralist thinkers and the role that they've played within the US academy. And I think that's also relevant to this, because a lot of the thinking that I'm talking about is very much influenced by kind of what we might refer to as sort of postmodernist thought and the kind of way that French structuralism has been metabolized with the US academy. So I'm just going to go over just briefly a few points here.
See, this is Gabrielle Rockhill's point, is that there is a infiltration of capitalist thought within the academy. Now, I think that what I've been focusing on is the infiltration of capitalist thought within psychology. If you look at my Ron Roberts or Carl Ratner videos, Neoliberal Psychology and Capitalism and Psychology, those authors who talk about that. Also, there is The Ruse of Repair, great book, another book that talks about the lies that we all have to be dealing with, the idiomatic lies that we have to deal with on a constant basis. Now, I think that the psychology is much more open to being taken over, because the role of psychology is to have a patient be a well-fitting member of society. And to be a well-fitting member of society, you need to enact that neoliberal subjectivity. I think that in critical theory, the infiltration in critical theory is a little bit more nuanced. So I am going to be talking about this institutionalization versus scholasticism in my video on historicity and Leo Strauss and scholasticism. So scholasticism is the problem that philosophy institutions face, is the problem of curriculum, is the problem of eclipsing people, even eclipsing, let's say, people from Kenya. You want to do a theory from Kenyan people, you hold up one person, but then lots of other people becoming eclipsed. That's a general problem within critical theory. But I think that critical theory has been, in a way, more resistant to, or at least philosophy has been more resistant to this invasion of uh, standpoint epistemology into the public sphere, into the agora. Now, what's happened recently is that even in the philosophy departments, people are being shut up. It's crazy because the philosophy is the highest ivory tower within the shitty university. Even that highest tower is now subject to this kind of scholasticism. So philosophy is not found in academia anymore because academia is a place to secure scholasticism, scholastic interest, this kind of dogmatism. Everybody must repeat the same things, and that's why I always come out like fuck, fuck intersectionality. I just say it because that kind of, you know, it shocks people when you say that because it's so against the religion, it's so against the theology, right? So I think that we need more of that, and we're gonna be continuing to do that. So there's going to be more of that. On the other hand, again, there is the threat of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it is a fine line that we're walking on in terms of this true critical theory, in terms of actual critical theory, which means that you need to have some sort of agora for the critical theory to operate. You need to have dialogue. You need to have some reeking, or how Salah Ben Habib would say, there needs to be some reeking of idealism. There needs to be some smell of idealism. Right now, what's happened is that we've destroyed all idealism, and all that we're left with is nightmare. We're left with nightmare in our personal relationships with one another, and we are left with nightmare with regards to our communities. And the psychologists are part and parcel to that, much more than critical theory is, because the psychologists have been creating this therapy culture that destroys community, and our community is destroyed. So, what do we do? We need psychology. Our family structures are destroyed. So, what do? We need to go to therapy. So, therapy is meant as this propaganda tool today. Therapy culture, this incessant need to heal, all of these idioms that you read, tarot cards, people selling tarot cards, witches, all of these kinds of new age spiritualities. And I differentiate that. There was another video where somebody talks about yoga as being a new age theory. Yoga is not new age, okay? Yoga is just yoga is not new age. Yeah, it might be part of this new age thing, but yoga is not. Anyway, meditation is not new age, okay? There are specific ideas that are new age, and we got to be a little bit more precise with that. Okay.
Here before closing about what I want to argue about this kind of decolonial theory. And, I'm really focusing here on the kind of work of US-based academics that have really positioned themselves as the vanguard of this theory, people associated with the modernity, decoloniality group like Walter Mignolo and Nelson Maldonado Torres. And this work is really...
Mignolo is really good.
Really explicitly anti-Marxist. Upon reading it, you would be left with the impression that Marxism is Eurocentric and antagonistic to struggles for decolonization, that historical struggles for socialism are distinct from projects of decolonization, and you would get the impression that a proper strategy for decolonization principally requires thinking differently, not organizing to build power, and certainly not attempting to take control of the state.
Well, you see that there's an obfuscation here, right? So in the first place, yes, I agreed with everything until she came to thinking differently. There are different types of decolonial movements, right? There are really good types of decolonial movements, and there are shitty intersectional kinds of decolonial movements. So the lumping together of all the left, all of these kinds of theories, what that does this throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing. And yeah, in a way, we do need to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the personal as political. That idea needs to be thrown out because it's completely a neoliberal idea, or the idea of standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology, again, is completely rooted within market liberalism. Search the similarities between market liberalism and standpoint epistemology on Google.
So I wanted to say these ideas about Marxism being Eurocentric and all that, they're really blatant mischaracterizations of Marxism and its relation to anti-colonialism. It's sometimes so tendentious to the point to kind of to be laughable, like arguing that, for example, that the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, two of the most important anti-colonial revolutions in history, are Western phenomena, things like this.
Yes, they are. Without the West, China, I read Chinese. China would not have gone through a revolution if it wasn't for Western intervention in Hong Kong. Okay, China needed to modernize so that it could challenge this colonialism. Marxism is purely only found within the European frame of reference. Now, the difference between the aporia, right? Aporia and democracy is not a Western thing. Aporia is not a Western thing. Having a place where aporia is able to realize itself, that place is absolutely not Western at all. And that's really what we should be talking about. Aporia. Aporia are the irresolvable internal contradictions, the place of logical disjunction, the place of incommensurability between text, arguments, and theories, or in the public sphere. That is the aporia, our ability to have incongruousness within and paradox and allow for paradox in our own subjectivity and in our public sphere, within what is allowed, what can we be included within this public sphere. Yes, we do need a border to defend the aporia, but the stronger the aporia is, the more we can take on, the more radical things that we can do, right? In contrast to aporia, we have kind of dogma. Dogma where we all have to, or scholasticism, where we all have to follow the line, where we all have to do the same things, where we all have to repeat the same idioms. Now, what's happened in the public sphere is that the possibility of aporia has been slowly, through Machiavelli and through the Republic, and there's a lot of bad faith arguments done by white supremacists, and that's why we're in this situation now. But one group puts in bad faith, the other group puts in bad faith, and now we have the situation that we have now, right? We need to be able to account for aporia.
There's a kind of dogmatism to the Marxism that I want to kind of highlight here. And also just want to briefly mention, there's in addition to the kind of dismissal of Marxism, as well as the dismissal of the importance of Marxism, particularly Third International Marxism and the Russian Revolution, for popularizing the idea of anti-colonialism and making an entire culture of anti-colonialism. There's also been written about influence of colonial scholarship. In addition to, of course, the way that this narrative really invisibilizes the centrality of Marxism to anti-colonial struggles in the Third World, to anti-colonial Marxist thinkers in the Third World, etc.
See, what's happening here is that you are not making a distinction between the city and the country within the so-called Third World, or which is actually imperialism, is what an argument that Adolf Reed makes, is that within this imperial structure, right, imperialism does not have absolute monarchical or power over the countryside in India. It doesn't. Okay, it might, in the bigger cities, but as you get out of the city, as you go into the mountains, there are people who, or if you go to the mountains of Afghanistan, there are people who just live their own shepherd lives, and they have no idea about capitalism, communism. They have their own self-sustaining ways of living in the, forests of Guatemala, and I don't know, in the far-reaching places. We cannot apply Marxist principles to those people. Marxism only applies to us, people within the technological realm of modernity that we exist today. Okay, that's the only place that Marxism can be applied to, and it should be applied to, absolutely. And again, one of the problems I have with Gabriel Rockhill is his defense of the Holy Family, and we're going to be actually talking about that book, The Holy Family, and Engels as well, because that's actually one of the root problems that I have with so-called Marxism. Okay, so that's, if there's any way I'm not a Marxist, it's the Feuerbach, right? The thesis on Feuerbach is the reason that we need to go back to Hegel. This is Zizek's line.
But I think a lot of this dismissal of Marxism happens why I think is really a kind of red herring, which is this kind of crude geographic determinism that treats the geographic location of a concept's purported origin as determinant of its value for deep.
No, see, this is another straw man here. The reason why, again, Jennifer is not responding well because she has to respond to strawmen because we live in a culture of platforming strawmen, right? Our culture, because we censorship so much, that all that's left is platforming strawmen. Again, same kind of problem that Vivek Chibber went through, and Majumdar and Catherine Liu in my other video. See, not everyone can be reduced to a kind of cost-benefit, production-minded capitalist thinking. A lot of us have traditional mindsets, which are fundamentally different gods than the gods of capitalism. Here we're going to talk about
colonial struggles. This idea that thought that comes from a European thinker can't be useful for anti-colonial struggles.
So this is a problem with standpoint epistemology generally, not a problem with decolonial thinking or post-colonial thinking.
This has been really critiqued as a kind of illogical way of thinking about how thought works. In the same way we don't say that like algebra is Persian, we don't have to say that Marxism is European. These are
absolutely algebra is. Look at the word algebra. Okay, literally the word Allah is embedded within the algebra, and the jebra means basically the reunification. Reunification with God is what algebra means. The reunification of God, and that's what logos is all about. I mean, that is incredibly culturally specific, embedded within a Judeo-Christian Abrahamic ideal of logos. Derrida's idea of logocentrism is real.
Forms of thought that evolve, acquire new meanings and associations, and shed others as they are transformed and used by people who live in distinct historical situations. And we can, work to understand that process, but we really can't understand it by simply condemning certain ideas, particular ideas that have been disseminated and developed all over the world, simply based on some kind of reified notion of the enunciation and the flattening of the world into Europe and its others. But again, I think this is a kind of a red herring because I really think that the dismissal of Marxism is more fundamental because there's this idea that any thought that comes from Europe can't be useful for thinking about decoloniality it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and it also doesn't make sense with the very European methodological basis that a lot of these theorists are operating with. As I said, a lot of their work is really coming out of kind of French postmodern thought and giving it a new spin. But I also wanted to note that this kind of determinism that casts European thought as unhelpful, as kind of basically gives it a kind of moral coding of bad, has its corollary in the presumption that epistemic tools for liberation, and I say epistemic tools because kind of liberation is oftentimes limited to the plane of thought in this work, that this kind of thinking must come from the third world or from quote unquote indigenous thought. Now, precisely what thoughts and how these might conform a viable strategy of decolonization is rarely specified. And as others, scholars who have critiqued decolonial theory have noted, some of these theorists who are making these pronouncements don't engage in any empirical investigation about indigenous thought and don't work in indigenous languages. So this is more a kind of prophetic strategy of saying, well, that I'll get to in a second. But I also want to say that this kind of makes sense because I think what is being proffered under the sign of quote unquote indigenous thought, just like other concepts like border thinking, subaltern thought, is really the kind of mythic promise of some kind of extra ideological subject that is somehow uncontaminated by Western thought. In other words, I think it's a figure that operates within the theorist's imagined confrontation.
This is the same kind of argument that they say that the family is a holy family. You see, it's the same argument that it's like an uncontaminated space. You can see how that's a contradiction right there. Those are the same people, right? In one sense, they say this area is uncontaminated. In another sense, they say that area is uncontaminated when they allow for contaminations on other sides. It's really interesting here.
Between Western thought considered bad and its others considered good. And so here it's really the kind of postmodernist fetishization of an abstract alterity, an abstract otherness, is really combined with the kind of...
It's not postmodern. I can tell you that I am from a small village and people have absolutely different ontologies. But see what Jennifer is doing here is she's tying ontology to race, which either she's doing it or the other people are doing it. Yes, that is a problem. But there are completely different ontotheological spiritual worlds that exist.
Warmed over trope of the noble savage, initially popularized in colonial discourse. And so indigeneity is really only valorized insofar as it can represent a space outside of Western capitalist modernity. I'm just going to wrap up in a second. And just to note that this kind of representation of indigenous people as if they were outside of capitalist modernity, in this case, it's given a positive moral charge, but again, it's really a kind of very familiar trope of colonial ideology. It's been identified and around the...
There are people who are outside of capitalist modes of thought. I was one of those people. I am one of those. That's hard to do. That is something that we need to defend.
Critiqued by Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Crucicanqui in her critique of decolonial theory. And she notes that kind of casting indigenous people outside of modernity in the way that this thinking does really ensnares them in indigenous stereotypes of the noble savage and as guardians of nature. And she says that while this invites an almost theatrical display of alterity, these kinds of representations enable the elite's neutralization of struggles and demands of Indigenous people, while casting them as multicultural adornments for neoliberalism. And I think that this kind of is very much in line with the kind of radical recuperative work that a lot of this.
So you can see that there's so much obfuscation. Yes, I agree that multiculturalism is problematic. And yes, I agree that multiculturalism is in service to neoliberalism. Walter Mignolo argues that. And you just shat on Walter Mignolo.
Thinking does to take, for example, Indigenous struggles for power and land and cast them in terms of something that ultimately amounts to a thinking otherwise, right? So I'll go ahead and wrap up for now and turn over to Adolf.
Okay, so I'm not going to go to Adolf's clip here because my point here is just to focus on Jennifer Ponce, because a lot of the things that she says are right on point with regards to this kind of my fear of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So, again, just to wrap up, ontology is not made because of our race. Ontology is tied to our daily rituals. Okay, this is my argument from Hegel, Confucianism. That is a long-term argument I've been thinking about. Okay, the crisis here is that capitalism, a system of exploitation, okay, has solved the problem. What problem that it has solved? It has solved the problem of incommensurability. The world is now flat. Most of us agree with capitalist realism. We are all subsumed within capitalist realism. If you are watching this video, you are probably subsumed within capitalist realism. However, not everyone in the world is. It hasn't monopolized the whole globe. Marxism is a particular cure for a particular disease. Okay, so because capitalism has solved the problem of incommensurability, meaning that within the desert of nothingness, we cannot find any meaning and we can't even communicate with each other. How can we communicate? The only way to trust each other is through the supply and demand capitalist models. And that's basically the desert of the real. But so because capitalism has solved the incommensurability problem, it has made commensurable. I can talk to anyone I want as long as I have the money for exchange and pay for it. And thus, capitalism has been naturalized. Because it solved the problem of incommensurability, it has been naturalized by both the left and the right. We look at lions, tigers, and bears, and what do we see? We see capitalism. But it is not natural. Different ontological worlds do exist. Different spiritual worlds do exist. I call it ontotheological. Okay, huaga is a word from the great book called The Archaeology of Violence. Amazing book. Different ontotheological worlds exist. I myself have created ideological spiritual worlds for myself, which I have gone into and out of, almost like an authentic version of what this positive version of this neoliberal subjectivity is, which I was playing with myself and finding myself and creating myself, and there's all this neoliberal subjectivity idioms of progressive capitalism. I was doing all that, and one of the things that you do is you go in and out of various religions, you go in and out of various ontotheological worlds, until I, settled on Confucianism after many years of studying religion. So the positive aspect here is you can create who you want to be. You can create your own world. The damaging aspect here about neoliberal subjectivity is that for the most part, you end up worshiping privilege. You end up following the lines of privilege. Okay, especially if we have a society that has not dealt with historical traumas, which is linked to self-colonization of the West and the colonization of the rest of the world that happened. Something particularly happened in Europe within the 1300s. There was something unusual that happened. Something about the geography of Europe. Something about how all of these countries, or soon-to-be countries, were in close proximity to each other, and they had to basically export their wars across the world so that they don't kill each other. This kind of something happened in the 1300s, this missionary enterprise, this kind of all of these Enlightenment things. Something interesting did happen in Europe that didn't happen anywhere else. There is something particular that happened in Europe, and that is the beginning of decolonization, is Europeans realizing that they colonized themselves. Or maybe the end, I don't know. The damaging aspect here, okay, is that we worship privilege at the end of the day. And so something, and within those 1300s, academia was heavily involved, heavily complicit within that system as well. And another thing that happened was, again, obviously capitalism, through these capitalist Dutch and English traders were the first ones to be investing and having stocks. And where did all that capital go? It didn't disappear. When the nobility of the last regime, do you think that their capital just disappeared? No, they became a new class of bourgeois. They knew how to move their money around or their capital around so that it could stay alive in different forms, in different energies. Okay, all that capital from the 1300s didn't disappear. Einstein recognized it as the most powerful force in the world. Compound interest being the most powerful force in the world. Einstein recognizes that the people who have the most power are the people who have had an interest within this pyramid scheme of neoliberalism, of this kind of religion of neoliberalism, this ontic ritual, these ontic daily rituals that we do, the oldest pyramid scheme in history. What is it? Is that we all participate in it regardless. It's right under our nose. Neoliberal thought kind of becomes self-conscious in the 1900s through the work of libertarian thinkers, or the marginalists, where everything is a marginal utility. Everything is seen as a marginal utility. Our relationship with other people are seen as a marginal utility. Oh, should I spend 50% of the time? Everything has become this amygdalic cost-benefit calculation that is impeding our ability to have frontal lobe relationships with each other. Our amygdala has taken over. So people like Hayek and von Mises would then come to idolize the universalism of this marginalist perspective. So now all of our questions are thrown into the ontological wood chipper known as the cost-benefit analysis of margins. A universalism was formed and applied onto every corner of the world. Commodification of water and sunlight. And what is worse than the commodification of humans? What is worse than the commodification of humans? See, the commodification of humans is sold to us as a freedom from slavery, as a freedom from war. But what really happens is not only do we commodify our earth, water, sunlight, and humanity, we commodify our emotions, and the basic tenets and the deepest relationships with one another has become this as well. And this is basically our cyberpunk or solar punk today, hopefully, dystopia or utopia that we are living in today. So thank you for taking the time to listen. This Critical Theory channel is so good. I highly recommend that everybody who follows me takes a look at all of these videos and then come back to me, and because I will be basically taking apart every critical theory video that these guys have produced, because honestly, critical theory, I can't find any other critical theory anywhere. I can't. Not in academia, not in Reddit. Critical theory is dead, and these are the last survivors. So thank you, this group, for having me respond to you. All the best.